Okay, so I decided to do a video on a subject that I've been thinking about for roughly 3 or 4 years now, since about 2014, right around when the phrase social justice warrior was kind of reaching up to the top of everyone's lexicon. Um, it became very common to see people interacting with people in the New Left, those who consider themselves social justice advocates, who would use phrases like power plus prejudice, or you can't be racist against white people, you can't be sexist against men, arguments like that. And they always invoked the concept of the power differential. And you can see more elaborate discussions of this in Francesca Ramsey's video on racism, and a lot of Anita Sarkeesian's videos on sexism in gaming and pop culture as a whole. One of the things that really caused me to grow dissatisfied with the center left and the center right. A lot of people like Sargon and Louis Laval and V and these other sort of skeptic YouTubers, they make it a habit to try and just point out all these double standards and behavior that the left has. And each time they do it, they think that they've discovered some big, flaw in their opponent's ideological facade. But of course, it became obvious, if you were paying close attention, that a lot of people in the social justice crowd are explicitly aware of these double standards and these contradictions, and they actually have a justification for it in the form of trying to tackle power imbalances within greater society, or at least that's how they see it. And it seemed like no one in the skeptic world or in the center left and the center right as a whole were really trying very hard to strike at the center of that reasoning. And it kind of amazed me to see that that was the case, given how obvious it was starting to become that this is a big thing for people in the New Left. They want to determine who has the most power in society and try and level the playing field using all these really aggressive, often hypocritical rules for how people should function within society based on their identity. Now, in my experience, the place where we see this reasoning used the most often is on platforms like Twitter and Tumblr, where someone will come along and say something demeaning about a group of people. They'll say something like, "Oh, I hate white people," or "kill all men," something like that. And then someone else will come along and point out that that's kind of that's discriminatory behavior, and they'll say, "Well, we can't really actually discriminate against these groups because they're in power, because they have power in society. So therefore, it's not really racism or sexism when it happens to them." We've all probably seen that. I know it seems anecdotal for me to just point it out myself. I'm not going to go and spend a bunch of time finding hundreds of examples of this happening, because I am pretty sure that we've all seen it by now. That being the case, there are other instances where people try and use an analysis of power as they see it to come to conclusions about how we should tackle society's problems. And I think almost every time I see someone invoke the power imbalance or the power differential, I'm always kind of disappointed with how they end up reasoning, especially how they end up actually identifying where the power is in society. I might go into that in greater detail in another video, but for right now, I just mainly want to attack a lot of the common ways in which I see people trying to explain away their actions by appealing to some kind of difference in social power between groups in society. So number one, I want to point out, especially when it comes to talking about policy that's being enacted by the state, we should be really, really careful about breaching principle just because the the particulars of history happen to be a certain way. Sometimes you'll hear people say historical disadvantage or historical oppression in place of references to power itself. And that's really interesting because if it's a historical problem that we're trying to correct, then once we say sign away our rights for hate speech protections in the Constitution or make reparations payments on the basis of identifying specific U.S. citizens' racial categories, that we're never going to get it back because you can't change the past. It's always going to be the past. And so if, for example, we determine that we need to make a bunch of rules about how to interact with black people on the basis of purely as a consequence of the role of slavery in the Black American experience, then those rules are always going to be in play because history involves slavery as an unchanging fact. So people should really consider carefully what kind of concessions they make here, because if we really follow the reasoning through, any rights that we give away, we'll never be getting them back. Sometimes people might try to make it sound like, oh, we'll just to correct for historical injustices, we're just going to make a temporary limitation on certain groups of people to try and help others catch up. Well, that's completely disingenuous, because if you really follow the reasoning through, that's not what they're actually calling for most of the time. Secondly, and this is really important, especially given how many people who reason in terms of power analysis think that they understand where structural power in society actually is, I think it's worth pointing out that by definition, if a minority group is ever able to impose any kind of undesirable conditions on another group, especially a majority group, via the state, you can't say that they're oppressed anymore. So, for example, if reparations legislation ever happened, by default, by deduction, the people making those demands would have state force behind them. That's real structural power. So it would automatically invalidate the whole claim in the first place. And I think that's really important, especially when we consider some of the policies we're seeing being enacted just at universities. And of course, sometime down the line, those are probably going to be pushed for at a national and federal level. Once you begin to understand that, I think you begin to see how weak a lot of the reasoning actually is, which leads me to my next point. A lot of these people seem to be engaging in the fallacy of relative privation. And I know it's kind of Reddit tier to just point out fallacies, but this is pretty pertinent to what's usually happening, especially in cases like I mentioned earlier, where we see people on Twitter and Tumblr just treating other people in really shitty ways and then trying to cover themselves by saying, oh, well, I'm not a part of a group that has structural power, so what I'm doing isn't really that big of a deal. Imagine if a serial killer were to go to court, and as he's brought before a jury, he points out that, sure, he ruined the lives of a couple dozen people, but there are regimes like Israel that have nuclear power that threaten the lives of thousands every day. And if we're really serious, we should be prosecuting those crimes instead of his. That's kind of what a lot of these social justice types do. They'll say, okay, yeah, maybe I'm, doing something that isn't so great, but since I don't have structural power, it's not that big of a deal. You shouldn't worry about my behavior. You should spend more time going after these other groups of people that supposedly have all the structural force and all the societal support they need to enact greater levels of harm. And I think in their minds, they see themselves as antagonizing people so that they can raise awareness of an issue. They're kind of trying to snap people out of it. I think that's what they believe that they're doing. In reality, they're just declaring war on people who weren't actually their enemies. And when someone comes up and they, hit you because you are wearing dreadlocks, it's not your obligation to treat them like a friend. So I'm not sure how these people overlook that, but on some level they do, and perhaps they're aware And it really is all just an excuse for some kind of psychopathology that they've developed. Whatever the case may be, the reasoning is just not very good. You're not going to raise awareness for an issue. You're not going to gather public confidence for your cause by attacking other random people to try and force them to join you in your little revolution. Another fallacy that we kind of see is where they substitute the attributes of a large number of people in the place of the attributes of the individual. So, for example, you'll see someone being quote unquote called out for using a slur or cultural appropriation or something like that. And that individual person is treated as if they are behaving in a way that will have wide societal consequences. Now, I can get back to that idea a little bit later because I think that pertains to the linguistic attitude towards structural oppression, which I'll talk about towards the end of this video. But in other cases where we're just talking about, say, the voting power of a group to impose their will through the electoral process, or greater spending power of a certain demographic, that all really has nothing to do with people at an individual level. So you can't say that someone who's behaving a certain way has societal backing in that behavior. And this is one of the really obvious things that kind of flies under the radar when people use these generalizations. If a much larger white man were to corner a smaller black teenager in an alley, well, yeah, sure, maybe he has, greater power in that particular social interaction. But if a black teenager has a gun, then everything changes. You can't sit there and say, oh, well, the white man has more structural power no matter what because he belongs to this category. It just doesn't make any sense. But we see people trying to reason like that anyway, and it's kind of amazing. It's one of many things that makes me think there's a psychological component here because it's just so obviously wrong. Another problem with power analysis and overgeneralizing or oversimplifying its content is that in a lot of cases, especially when we're talking about sexism or racism, people talk about punishing the entire category when it's really only a few people within those categories that are actually part of anything that could be called a structure of power. So, for example, most white people, especially working class white people, are getting poorer over time. It's just a small number of families that are increasing in wealth exponentially. On the other hand, it's only a small number of men that really make it to financial success in life. A lot of men are homeless. A lot of men are working difficult, low-paying jobs that are dangerous to their health. So when we try to wage war on these groups of people, whether it be through the state or through activism, we're not really actually holding power accountable. We're in many cases just antagonizing everyday people. I think that's actually a major component of modern social justice activism. It's disguised as a revolutionary activity, but in reality, it's mostly the working class and the lower middle class that are being threatened by activist behavior. Most wealthy people seem to benefit from it. I think they use activists as a kind of biological terror agent against the rest of the population, and it disguises itself in this very self-righteous indignance, but it's all a facade. Now we're entering the part of the video where I'm going to talk about how linguistics and social psychology and post-structural theory contribute to our understanding of structural power and why I think there's a problem there. Occasionally, if you hear people who are really versed in academic theory, people like Catherine Cross or John McIntosh, if you hear them describe structural power imbalances, they'll talk about how even things like everyday language are reinforcing these cultural assumptions that keep sexism and racism alive. I think it's really fascinating that people take this view because if it's true that sexism and racism permeate every aspect of society, then that would mean by default that it's impossible to be an anti-sexist or an anti-racist, because even anti-sexism and anti-racism are being expressed in the English language in the 21st century in that white cis hetero supremacist context. So therefore, even anti-racism is itself sexist and racist and homophobic and what have you. The very idea is self-refuting. And it's kind of amazing to me that more people haven't pointed that out, because I think if you take a look at a lot of the more extreme social constructionist reasoning, you see that there's this obvious flaw, that they're trying to be revolutionary, but they can't manage it, because even at a theoretical level, even in principle, what they're aiming for is a paradoxical, and it contradicts itself. Which leads me to my last point, and I wanted to save this for the end for a reason. And that's because it seems like a lot of people get really upset when you try and argue on empirical grounds. But I'm just going to point out that it's actually a lot more difficult to identify who in society has power and who doesn't than people make it out to be. Because, for example, women in their 20s actually earn more than men in the UK and the US, if I'm not mistaken. Black people have more college degrees in the United States on average than any other group. Women live longer than men do. Gay people also earn more than their straight counterparts. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that these people are, anyone in these groups are unilaterally privileged, but that's kind of the point. No one is completely oppressed and no one is completely an oppressor. It's much more complicated. By simplifying the generalizations that we're making in this non-trivial way, we're actually causing a lot of problems, and I think activists are seeing that. They're making a lot of enemies out of people that they've gone after for no real reason, that probably may have more in common with them than they would have previously thought. Lastly, I'd just say that a lot of very wealthy, white, ostensibly liberal figureheads in society use seemingly underprivileged groups as an excuse for the choices that they make that do have actual structural consequences. We see almost every major corporation, from Google to Kroger, decorating their logos for Pride Month. We see them promoting tweets on Twitter for DeRay McKesson and other black activists. We see wealthy left-leaning comedians like Bill Maher wishing recessions on the rest of the country because he wants to win a political victory, supposedly in the name of championing equality on behalf of these underrepresented and marginalized groups. And that's one thing that they do that, but it's a whole other thing that a lot of people in these willingly embrace the patronizing influence of these various upper echelon characters in society. Foucault himself said that power is fluid, and I think this is what he's talking about. Just because one group may be disadvantaged doesn't mean that there isn't some other group out there that's willing to try and substitute its own force supposedly to benefit them. Now, of course, I think a lot of these people are very cynical in their motivations, whether we're talking about the Clintons or Maher or anyone you could think of. It's fascinating to note how many people consider California to be the linchpin of progressive politics when you look at how massive the wealth discrepancies there are in that particular state between the richest and the poorest. All these objectivists and so-called Marxists are constantly arguing with each other, and somehow that detail seems to get glossed over every time. A lot of modern progressivism seems to be a lot of people just complaining there's one wealthy white oligarchy, and somehow things would be better if they were just a little bit more diverse. In other words, it's not really revolutionary at all. It's not really changing anything. All the structural problems that we had before that were supposed to disappear with this final collapse of capitalism just seem to be persisting and maybe even getting worse. And I think that's really interesting that no one wants to talk about that. We all just want to keep having arguments over taxing people more or less. And it's just interesting that that's the best we can come up with. Hopefully, once you recognize that, you begin to see why uh, these really frail, simplistic, ham-fisted attempts at power analysis are a big part of the problem. In full disclosure, I'm not even sure that I'm looking for genuinely revolutionary politics. I try to think of things in terms of shades of gray rather than utopia and dystopia. In any case, I hope this video has been informative and that somebody finds some meaning in it. I'll be back for another video maybe in a couple weeks, and thank you for watching.